while I didn't like the effects and the consequences of using drugs, using drugs was not one of the things that I really wanted to work on that much, if that makes any sense. It's almost like I didn't like what the drugs had done to me, and I didn't like the consequences, like the prospects of maybe losing my job and losing my marriage, but I still liked what drugs did for me, physically and emotionally.
Much of what we will tell you today will be surprising. It is scientific, evidence-based data, but it will contradict what you believe professionally and emotionally.
First, what most of us know about substance abuse and addiction is very incomplete. We are all wearing masks of ignorance. Scientists are working to unmask the mechanisms behind the compulsive behavior associated with addiction. Most of us understand that the pleasure and intoxication associated with taking certain drugs is about increased dopamine in the brain.
But we are not aware that drug addiction is more about the loss of glutamate control from the prefrontal cortex and the cascade of molecular and genetic events that change how the brain processes information and controls behavior.
Finally, cues associated with previous drug use initiate drug craving in an addict. This is a physiological response. Thus, all that we thought was psychological is actually physiologically based. With each drug-related event, it becomes more and more difficult for the user to resist the physiological-driven desire for more drug. With continued drug intake, the user leaves their psychological realm of hedonistic behavior or the pursuit of symptom relief and enters the physiological realm of programmed behavior.
The brain's last natural defenses against addiction are those neural pathways that evaluate the risk-benefit of wants versus needs. When these neural circuits are altered, the perceived benefit of a drug experience is grossly inflated in value over other wants and needs. The risks of obtaining and using drugs are acknowledged but minimized or ignored. For example, Lyle, who was a college and medical school graduate, he completed his pediatric residency and started an anesthesia residency.
Right, on his way to becoming a successful pediatric, well-sought-after anesthesiologist.
And he was following in the footsteps of his father and his brother, who was a radiologist.
Right.
Well, losing my medical license, losing my job in the anesthesia residency program, losing my family, losing my savings, my bank accounts, my car, my house, winding up in crack houses.
What attracts our attention, connected to brain-related behavior, is how Lyle seems to humanly prove what the brain researchers are showing us.
Well, I would use drugs with crack dealers, and I've been in the company of prostitutes. I've found myself locked in a bathroom at a crack house using IV cocaine, dripping blood all over the floor and sink, out of my arms, using so much I'd almost pass out. And I've been kicked out of crack houses because they thought I was too much of a risk of overdosing in their presence, with people that I would have no business being with ever. Horrified to be there, absolutely scared to death, but determined that I was going to be there so that I could get what I wanted.
So that I could be there to get what I wanted. Drug addiction destroys careers, marriages, families, lives. It did all those things to Lyle. But drugs do not destroy the brain, they change it. If the outlook for the addicted patient or colleague is to improve, there must be an appreciation of how neurons and neural pathways in the brain are changed. The goal of current research is to identify the mechanisms by which these changes occur in hopes that this will suggest new and more effective treatments.
Why don't we begin by reviewing the parts of the brain puzzle that we have put together and understand this deeply?
In many ways, addictive drugs are like viruses. A virus invades a cell's nucleus, inserts itself into a cell's DNA, and changes the focus of the cell's behavior toward producing more and more virus particles. Addictive drugs invade the brain, trigger molecular changes that lead to the takeover of the genetic machinery of neuroplasticity, change how neurons in certain brain regions interact with one another. The end result is drug-seeking and drug-taking behavior that is increasingly difficult to control. A person doing drugs becomes an addict when these behaviors become compulsive and physiologic.
Drug addiction, then, is a chronic relapsing disease of the brain. It has a characteristic set of signs and symptoms. It has a demonstrated lesion. It has a predictable natural course and outcome if untreated. Finally, it has risk factors, early warning signs, diagnostic criteria, and recommended treatments.
Like other chronic diseases, such as type 2 diabetes mellitus, addiction is not time-limited and it is not curable. But for many addicts, their disease can be controlled or managed through a variety of treatment options. However, there is a continuous risk of relapse and a high rate of relapse.
But I really don't know for sure where it comes from. I mean, it seems to be a drive that he has, and I don't know really why he has it. It seems to be innate to his personality, or his makeup right now. These cravings that he still describes and has to deal with, just a part of his existence.
Positron emission tomography and functional magnetic resonance imaging have enabled scientists to identify those regions of the brain that are altered in addicted patients. This is the physiological seat of craving in addiction.
When addicts are not actually given their drug of choice, but are presented with either drug paraphernalia, a picture of their drug, or with videos of other addicts taking that drug, three major regions of the brain show increased activity: the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, and hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. Normal brains do not show any increased activity when presented with the same images. Note that no actual drug was administered. Thus, the brain of an addict is different from the brain of the non-addict. For each kind of neuron, dopaminergic, GABAergic, and glutaminergic projects to each region. These three regions receive input from neurons originating in the ventral tegmental area. The neurotransmitter is dopamine. The nucleus accumbens sends negative feedback information back to the neurons in the ventral tegmental area. The neurotransmitter here is GABA. Neural circuits going back and forth between the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex all use glutamate as a neurotransmitter. These circuits comprise the brain's pleasure-reward system. All experience passes through this system. Both good and bad experiences increase the concentration of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. The greater the concentration of dopamine, the more intense the experience. The amygdala decides whether the experience is good or bad, pleasurable or aversive, to be repeated or avoided. The hippocampus records and stores memories of the experience. When, where, with whom. Finally, the prefrontal cortex puts the experience in perspective and establishes priorities. When any person is administered any intoxicant drug, there is increased activity in the dopaminergic projections from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens, amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex, forming the initial pathway in the brain's pleasure-reward system. All substances involved in addictive disorders, including alcohol, opioids, cocaine, and amphetamine, increase the concentration of dopamine in these circuits. The greater the concentration of dopamine, the better the high. Chronic drug ingestion leads to an orderly, predictable series of changes that overvalue positive memories of the drug highs, undervalue the memories of other preferable activities, and eventually force the brain to focus on drug-seeking and drug-taking behavior. The brain lesions in addiction are the changes that occur in the brain's pleasure and reward circuits. They include the overvalued imprinted memories of drug highs and events leading up to these highs.
The initial step leading to the brain lesions associated with addiction is overstimulation of the dopaminergic pathway. This leads to tolerance and withdrawal.
And I went from using 2 or 3 cc's every few days to using up to 50 or 60 cc's every day. That's a lot. It's a lot. And I got used to doing that on a daily basis, and my tolerance built up and my need built up. And I quickly got to a point that physically I needed it, or I would have withdrawal symptoms. And at the time, I didn't even realize that that's what they were. I didn't recognize it as withdrawal, but I would wake up in the morning cold and clammy and shaking with general malaise and aching bones, and I just didn't feel right all over until I could get to work and use that first shot of fentanyl, and then it made it all okay.
The second step is early downstream involvement of the amygdala and hippocampus. This leads to imprinting of drug cues, drug craving, and depression during abstention. The third and final step is late downstream involvement of the anterior cingulate gyrus and orbitofrontal region of the prefrontal cortex. This leads to loss of inhibition and to compulsive drug seeking and relapse.
The prefrontal cortex slowly, insidiously, but progressively overweighs this information. The prefrontal cortex is supposed to integrate the information from other areas to say, yes, that drug experience was very pleasurable, but it is coming at too high a price. Therefore, don't do it. But over time, this inhibitory process becomes dysfunctional.
While I didn't like the effects and the consequences of using drugs, using drugs was not one of the things that I really wanted to work on that much, if that makes any sense. It was almost like I didn't like what the drugs had done to me, and I didn't like the consequences, like the prospects of maybe losing my job and losing my marriage, but I still liked what drugs did for me, physically and emotionally.
So let's correlate this with an addict who says that he wants to quit using. He has moments.
I remember one particular instance of being in a bathroom off to the side of where the surgical suites are. I had my scrub leg up and a needle in my vein. And I just looked around in the room and thought, what in the fuck are you doing? Look at yourself. You know, look at what you've become. Look at what you're doing. And I thought, you know, what would my coworkers, what would my boss, what would my patients think if they saw me right now? And although I continued to use for a while after that, I had an awareness that I was becoming something that I had no intention of becoming, that it had gotten out of control, that I had to do something.
This is typical. This is the part of the explanation of brain alteration that is not understood, where our understanding is incomplete. Not to forget that he leaves his moment of clarity in the bathroom and goes directly into the OR and gives anesthesia.
Lyle Hassel was in this anesthesia department for almost a year, and no one saw or reported any of his unusual behavior or certain visible distress, either as a single incident or as a pattern of behavior. As the disease progresses, memories of the euphoria and avoidance of the craving and depression create distortions and contradictions in thinking.
The high that I got from fentanyl was one of the most wonderful senses of euphoria that I ever felt. Fentanyl and sufentanil made me feel like nothing mattered. Whatever sadness or fear or insecurity or stress that I felt prior to injecting it all instantly went away. I felt like I was floating and nothing mattered. It was my way of escape from everything. It was wonderful. In a way, coke, fentanyl, crack, it becomes God. You know, I don't have any tangible God in front of me that gives me instant gratification, but I can administer a syringe full of cocaine and I feel like it. You know, it does exactly what I wanted to do.
This new information has really changed how I look at colleagues with substance use disorders. Simply stated, I know now they can't get help because they can no longer ask for it. We have shown you they have a chronic brain disease that prevents them from doing so. We just have to face up to that. With such an intractable situation, the only way we can help them is to identify them and get them into a confidential treatment program. And by the way, by helping them, we help ourselves. We will have more effective people. We will provide safer patient care. We will have less disruption of the group routine, and we will spend less money in recovery efforts. We need to teach everyone in the operating room the signs, symptoms, and patterns of substance abuse so that they can recognize this dysfunction and save an addicted colleague. Watch for the upcoming campaign on this subject from All Anesthesia.